Derek Holloway snatched the range log off the table and threw it at her feet in front of 200 soldiers. "Pick that up and walk yourself back out that gate." Maya looked at the log on the ground. She looked at the 200 men watching her. Then she crouched down, picked it up, and set it back on the table, open to his last qualification scores. She tapped the page once with 2 fingers. "Your unit failed this block 3/4 running, Senior Chief." Her voice didn't rise. "That's why I'm here. Not for you. For them." The range went silent. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. He didn't know it yet. Subscribe and drop your city below. I want to see how far she travels. The morning Maya Reynolds drove through the gates of Naval Support Facility, Oceana's remote training annex. The temperature was 41 degrees, and the ground was still frozen from the night before. She parked her government-issued sedan at the far end of the lot, sat for a moment with the engine off, and looked at the facility through the windshield. It was exactly what she expected. Long, flat buildings, gravel paths worn into mud by boots, a weapons range in the distance, and the particular quality of silence that military installations carry. Not peaceful silence, but waiting silence. The kind that held its breath before something happened. She pulled her bag from the back seat. One bag. 42 liters worn at the shoulder strap, no unit patches, no rank insignia anywhere on her clothing. She wore civilian clothes, dark pants, a plain thermal layer, lace-up boots that had seen serious mileage. To anyone watching from the administrative building's windows, she looked like someone's assistant. Someone who had made a wrong turn and ended up in the wrong parking lot. That was fine. That was exactly fine. The assignment was straightforward on paper. The Naval Special Warfare Command had flagged a support unit Detachment 7 of the NSWC's Operational Readiness Division as underperforming on cross-functional training assessments for the 3rd consecutive quarter. The unit's scores on integrated tactical operations communication protocols and unit cohesion metrics had dropped in a pattern that the command's performance analysts found troubling. Not catastrophic. Not yet. But the kind of slow decline that in a deployed environment could get people killed. Maya had been brought in as an external evaluator. A civilian tactical instructor contracted through a program that pulled retired operators and specialists to assess units that had gone stale from the inside. Her job was to spend 3 weeks embedded with Detachment 7, run assessments, observe leadership dynamics, and submit a report that the command would use to determine next steps. She was 27 years old. She looked younger. She walked through the main entry and gave her credentials to the duty officer at the front desk, a young petty officer, 2nd class, who took her contractor badge, looked at the name, and then looked at her. The way people often looked at her when they first saw her name attached to her face. "Maya Reynolds," he said. "That's right. You're the evaluator." "I am." He processed her paperwork in a silence that was not quite comfortable and handed her a visitor's packet. "Senior Chief Holloway has been notified you're on deck. He asked that you wait in the briefing room." "Where's the unit now?" "Morning PT. They'll be back in about 40 minutes. "I'll find them." The petty officer looked up. "Ma'am," Senior Chief said. "I heard what he said." She offered a small neutral smile. "I'll check in with him when he's done." She walked out before the petty officer could decide whether to stop her. The unit was running. She found them on the back track, 2 miles of paved loop that circled the east side of the facility, and she watched them from the edge of the field as they came around the final turn. 22 men, varying levels of condition, all running in loose formation. Not the tight, coordinated movement of a unit that trained like a team, but the scattered clustering of individuals who happened to be running in the same direction. She noticed who was at the front. She noticed who was at the back. She noticed who was looking at their feet and who was looking ahead. And she noticed the man leading them. Derek Holloway ran the way. Some men carry themselves in every other aspect of their life, as though the space around him existed for his benefit. He was built for authority. 6'2", solid in the shoulders, the kind of physical presence that had at some point in his career been enough to resolve most disagreements before they started. He had the face of someone who had made being hard look easy for long enough that he'd started to believe hardness was the same thing as strength. He saw her standing at the edge of the field. He didn't break stride, but he saw her. She didn't wave. She didn't move. She just watched the formation complete its final lap and slow to a walk as the unit hit the cooldown zone near the far building. She waited until they were stretching before she walked toward them. The conversations that had started when the men stopped running cut off as she approached. Not all at once. In pieces. Like lights going out one by one down a hallway. By the time she was close enough to address the group, about 15 of the 22 men had noticed her, and the other 7 noticed that their peers had noticed her, and the whole unit had gone into that particular state of collective attention that soldiers fall into when something unusual enters their environment. Derek Holloway was drying his face with a towel. He lowered it slowly when she stopped in front of the group. "Maya Reynolds," she said. "External Evaluator, NSWC Performance Liaison Program. I'll be with your unit for the next 3 weeks." Nobody said anything for about 4 seconds. Then Derek Holloway said, "You're early." "By 40 minutes, yes. I left word at the desk that you should wait in the briefing room." "I know." He looked at her with the particular kind of attention that men give to challenges they haven't fully classified yet. "The protocol for contractor personnel arriving on a training installation is to report to the duty officer, which I did, and then to the point of contact for the assigned unit, which I'm doing now." She held his gaze, not aggressively, not with the kind of locked-jaw challenge that would have made this easy for him. She held it the way you hold something you're not worried about dropping. "If there's a version of the protocol I'm not aware of, you can note it in your debrief with the command." Something moved across Derek Holloway's face. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was recognition. The recognition that this was not going to be the kind of contractor visit he'd had before, where someone showed up, ran a checklist, watched some exercises, and filed a report that changed nothing. He was recalibrating, and he didn't like having to. He turned to his men before he turned back to her. "Formation," he said. "Now." They moved with the practiced speed of people who had been doing this for years. Within 20 seconds, 22 men were standing in 3 loose rows facing him, and he was standing slightly to one side with Maya positioned near the front of the group. He spoke to his men. "This is the evaluator the command sent, Ms. Reynolds." He said the title in a way that technically gave her nothing to object to, while making clear he considered it a courtesy. He was extending not a status, he was acknowledging. "She'll be observing our training for the next few weeks. You treat her with professionalism. Any questions about what she's doing here, why the command felt we needed an external evaluation, or what this means for the unit, you can direct those questions to me privately." He paused. "Or you can ask her right now. It was a test." Everyone in that formation understood it was a test. The men were watching her to see what she would do with the opportunity he'd just handed her, which was not really an opportunity, but an invitation to be awkward, to over-explain herself, to establish her authority in a way that would undercut it. She let the silence sit for exactly long enough. "I'm not here to change anything," she said. "I'm here to watch. You'll know I'm observing because I'll be there. You won't always know what I'm noting, because that's not your concern. Do what you do. Run the way you run. Lead the way you lead." She looked at Derek when she said the last sentence. "That's all I need." She turned and walked toward the building. She heard behind her the controlled exhale of a man who had been expecting something he could immediately win. He hadn't gotten it. That was the first thing she needed him to know. The briefing room was standard issue, a long table, folding chairs. A projector mounted to the ceiling that hadn't been updated since the early 2010s, and a whiteboard along one wall with diagrams from a previous session still visible in faded marker. Maya sat at the far end of the table, opened a slim notebook, and was writing in it when Derek Holloway came in 15 minutes later. He sat down across from her. Not at the head of the table. Across from her. It was a choice, and she filed it. "Let me be straight with you," he said. "I'd prefer it. This unit doesn't have a performance problem. The metrics the command flagged are an artifact of a reconfigured evaluation rubric that doesn't account for the specific type of operations this unit runs. We've had this conversation with the command before, and it hasn't landed because whoever's running the analysis doesn't understand what we actually do day to day." "What do you actually do day to day?" she asked. I was ready for the question. He spent the next 12 minutes explaining the unit's operational structure, the nature of their support role within the broader special operations pipeline, the kinds of missions they fed into, and the training cycle they ran. He was thorough. He was also, she noticed, careful. He gave her enough to sound cooperative while giving her exactly nothing she could use to challenge any specific practice. When he finished, she said, "When was the last time someone outside the unit ran an assessment of your leadership culture?" A small silence. "We've had command reviews. Leadership culture. Not performance reviews. Not safety audits. Not qualification checks. The way your people relate to each other, to rank, to authority, to the process of raising a concern or acknowledging a mistake." He looked at her. "That's a very specific question for someone who just got here. It's in the assessment framework the command sent you when they notified you of this evaluation." Another small silence. Longer this time. "We're a high-performing unit under significant operational pressure," he said. "The culture reflects that." "I know what that means," she said. "I've worked in those cultures." He studied her for a moment. She could see him trying to place her. She was young, she was female, she was civilian, and she had just answered him in a way that implied direct operational experience without claiming it explicitly. I didn't know what to do with the gap between what he saw and what she was projecting, and that gap was going to bother him until he found a way to close it. "What's your background?" he asked. "It's in my contractor file," she said. "The command cleared it before I was assigned." "I'm asking you directly." "I know." She picked up her notebook. "I'll need to observe the morning training block. Can you get me on the schedule for the navigation exercise this week?" He stared at her for a moment that lasted exactly as long as he needed to decide he wasn't going to win this particular exchange. "I'll have my admin add you to the roster," he said. "Thank you." He stood up. He was halfway to the door when he stopped, his back still to her. "You should know that this unit has a certain way of operating," he said. "People who don't understand it tend to get in the way." "Then I'll try not to get in the way," she said. He left. The door closed. She looked at the whiteboard diagrams for a moment, then went back to her notebook. She wrote 3 words. She circled one of them. She underlined it twice. The first training exercise she observed was a land navigation assessment in the back quadrant of the facility, roughly 400 acres of mixed terrain that the unit used for movement and positioning drills. The exercise was designed to test small team navigation under time pressure with degraded communications, which in practice meant that 4-person elements were given coordinates and had to move between points using maps and compasses with radio contact limited to specific check-in windows. Maya was assigned to observe Element 3. Element 3 was led by Logan Pierce. Logan Pierce was 24, had been with Detachment 7 for about 14 months, and occupied the precise social position in the unit of someone who had attached his identity to the most dominant person in the room. He laughed at Derek's jokes 30% louder than other people laughed at Derek's jokes. He repeated Derek's evaluations of other people as though they were his own conclusions. He had the specific energy of someone who had discovered that proximity to power was faster than building his own. When Maya fell in with his element at the start line, Logan looked at her and said, "No offense, but you're going to slow us down." "I'll keep up," she said. "This is rough terrain," he said. "It's not a parking lot walk." She looked at him with genuine patience. "I said I'll keep up." He exchanged a glance with Kyle Bennett, the other member of the element she hadn't met yet, a stocky, quiet man who had Derek's practiced dismissiveness without Derek's intelligence. Kyle shrugged. Logan turned back to the start line. "Your call," he said, "but don't ask us to wait." She didn't ask them to wait. What happened over the next 4 hours was the kind of thing that starts small and accumulates. Logan navigated by instinct more than technique, which worked well enough on open ground, but began to fail when the terrain folded in a way that made compass bearings deceptive. He overshot the 3rd checkpoint by 300 meters before he caught the error. He corrected it with the exasperated confidence of someone who didn't want to examine how they'd made the mistake in the first place. Maya said nothing. She was keeping her own notes. She had clocked the terrain change 2 minutes before Logan overshot the point. She had not said anything because it wasn't her exercise. She was not there to run the navigation. She was there to see how the element ran it. But she was also navigating, quietly without announcing it. Her map was unmarked at the start, and she hadn't touched the compass she'd been issued. She was reading the ground itself, the drainage patterns, the vegetation density, the slight angles of rise and fall that to someone who had spent years moving through terrain with her life depending on reading it correctly were as legible as street signs. At the fourth checkpoint, the element leader of a neighboring team radioed in that he was disoriented and needed reference points. Logan started to respond with a bearing that would have helped, but was based on his current position as he believed it to be, which was not quite where he actually was. Maya said, "Hold." Logan looked at her. "Your position's off by about 60 meters northwest," she said. "If you give him a bearing from where you think you are, he'll drift further." "I know where I am," Logan said. "You're at the wrong side of the drainage cut," she said. "You crossed it 20 minutes ago. Your elevation reading put you on the east bank. You're on the west bank." He looked at her. He looked at his map. He looked at the terrain around him with the beginning of the uncertainty that comes when you realize someone might know something you don't. Kyle walked to the nearest rise, looked out over the terrain, looked back, said nothing for a moment, then said, "She's right." Logan rechecked. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he got back on the radio and gave the other element leader the correct bearing. They made it back to the finish in the second fastest time of all 6 elements. Logan didn't thank her, but he stopped making comments about the terrain not being a parking lot. That night, she sat in the small room she'd been assigned in the visiting quarters and wrote for 2 hours. She wasn't writing her report. She wasn't writing observations about navigation errors or technical capability gaps. She was writing about patterns. The way Derek's authority moved through the unit like water, finding its shape, not through a single dramatic moment, but through 100 small moments of approval and disapproval, through who he elevated with a word and who he flattened with a look, through the way younger soldiers angled themselves toward him in group settings, and the way older operators who might have challenged him had quietly found reasons to stay out of his way. She'd seen this before. Not in the military. Before the military. Before everything. But she'd also seen it in units that were 10 times more capable than this one, and she knew exactly what it cost. When people stopped speaking honestly, they stopped learning. When they stopped learning, they got slower. When they got slower in an environment where the other side was always working, the consequences arrived in ways that couldn't be predicted until they were already happening. The culture wasn't Derek's fault exactly. He hadn't invented it. He had inherited tendencies and amplified them because they worked for him in the short term. The problem with things that work in the short term is that the long term always arrives. She turned off the light at 2300 and was asleep within minutes. She had a quality of rest that came from years of training herself to sleep when the opportunity existed, regardless of what was coming. What was coming could wait until morning. The following day, she was assigned to observe a tactical communication exercise, a simulation that tested the unit's ability to maintain operational coherence while managing multiple simultaneous information streams. It was the kind of drill that exposed how a unit thought collectively, which was different from how any individual in the unit thought alone. Derek ran it himself. He ran IT efficiently with the automated authority of someone who had done this many times and had long ago stopped questioning whether his approach was the best one or simply the most familiar. He moved through the exercise like a conductor who had memorized the score so completely that he was no longer actually listening to the orchestra. Maya watched from the edge of the room, her notebook open, her pen moving at intervals. 20 minutes in, she saw the problem before it developed. One of the junior operators, a young man named Tomas Ruiz, who had been with the unit for 4 months and had the particular anxiety of someone still calibrating exactly how much he was allowed to say, caught an inconsistency in the incoming data feed that Derek had missed. Tomas flagged it internally. She could see it on his face. The moment of recognition followed immediately by the moment of calculation. Is this worth saying something? And if I'm wrong, what happens? And if Derek has already moved past it, is it too late? He said nothing. The exercise continued. 8 minutes later, the inconsistency cascaded into a scenario failure. The simulation logged a significant miss. Derek shut the exercise down, ran the debrief with the unit, and identified 3 technical factors that had contributed to the failure. None of them were what actually happened. What actually happened was that Tomas Ruiz saw a problem and said nothing because he was afraid. After the debrief, when the unit had dispersed for lunch, Maya found Tomas at his locker. He looked up at her with the wariness of someone who had learned that attention usually meant something bad was coming. "You caught it," she said. He went very still. "The data discrepancy in the feed, at the 20-minute mark. You caught it." She said it flatly without judgment, just stating a fact. His jaw tightened. "I wasn't sure." "You were sure enough," she said. "Your face said you were sure." A long moment. I was working out what she wanted from this conversation, what she was going to do with it. "You going to put that in your report?" he asked. "I'm going to put a lot of things in my report," she said. "But not your name." She closed her notebook. "I need you to understand that what happened in that room today is not about your technical ability. Your technical ability is fine. What happened in that room today is about something else entirely. And it's not your fault, but it is a problem." She left him there. She didn't wait for a response. She didn't need one. She needed him to sit with what she'd said for the rest of the afternoon. She needed him to start understanding, even if only at the edge of his awareness, that the silence he had chosen, the choice he'd made in those few seconds at the 20-minute mark, had not been neutral. It had consequences. And it wasn't because he was weak or cowardly or technically inadequate. It was because someone had built an environment where speaking was more dangerous than staying silent. At dinner, Derek Holloway sat across the long table from his senior NCOs, and at some point in the meal, he looked down toward the end of the table where Maya was eating alone, not conspicuously, not as a statement, but because she was thinking and eating simultaneously, and preferred the quiet end of the table, and he said something low to the man beside him. Both of them looked at her. The man beside him, one of the senior operators named Garrison, who had the particular stillness of someone who had been in too many places to be impressed by very much, said something back. Derek's expression shifted very slightly. Not in a way most people would catch. Maya caught it. She kept eating. 2 days before the navigation exercise, Derek made his first real move. It came during a unit-wide physical assessment, a standard battery, that the unit ran quarterly, covering a series of timed events designed to test the fundamentals. The assessment was mandatory for all unit personnel, including attached observers, and Maya had been notified through the standard administrative channel the evening before. She showed up in the same clothes she'd worn every day. No change. Derek came up beside her before the first event and said quiet enough that only she could hear, "You don't have to do this one." "I know," she said. "I'm giving you an out. It's not an insult." "I know what it is," she said. "I'll run with the group." He looked at her for a moment. "It's your call." The first event was a timed 2-mile run. Maya finished in the top third of the group. She didn't push to be first. She ran at a pace that looked effortless only to people who understood that effortless pacing was itself a skill, that it took a particular kind of control to never redline. The second event was a load-bearing movement, a weighted ruck march over broken terrain. Maya ran it with 22 pounds, same as everyone else, and finished without breaking form. The third event was a series of functional strength assessments, pull-ups, loaded carries, obstacle transitions. She moved through them with the unhurried economy of someone who had been trained to conserve energy in contexts where efficiency was survival. At the end, when the scores were being tallied, Logan Pierce looked at his own numbers and then looked at hers and said not to her, but loudly enough, "Guess the evaluator came to show us up." She turned to look at him, calmly. "You beat me on the ruck," she said, "by 40 seconds. I didn't have a response for that. She'd tracked his numbers. He hadn't tracked hers. Derek was standing nearby. He'd heard all of it. He didn't say anything, but something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatic, not visible, just there in the specific quality of how the space around her had changed since that morning. The men were watching her differently. Not with respect, not yet, not most of them. but with the beginning of a question they hadn't had before. They didn't know who she was, and not knowing was doing something to them. That was fine. Uncertainty was a tool like everything else. You used it when you needed it, and she was not done using it. On the final evening of the first week, Derek Holloway came to find her. She was in the briefing room again, alone, working by the light of a desk lamp she'd borrowed from the supply cabinet, and she heard him in the hallway before she heard him knock. His footsteps had a particular cadence, measured, deliberate, never quite casual. He knocked anyway. "Come in," she said. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He was still in his duty uniform. He had the particular energy of someone who had spent a full day carrying something and hadn't put it down yet. "I owe you something," he said. She looked up from her notebook. "What's that?" He came a few steps into the room and stopped. He was working something out internally. She could see it, the cost-benefit calculation that a man like Derek Holloway ran every time he considered giving ground. "The physical assessment," he said. "I didn't expect you to run it the way you did. I thought—" He stopped. "You thought I'd quit before the end," she said. "I thought you'd struggle," he said. "I was prepared to step in if you were going to get hurt." "That's considerate," she said without sarcasm. She meant it. Whatever else he was, he hadn't wanted her to get injured on his watch. "It surprised me," he said. "That's all." She looked at him for a moment. In the lamplight, standing in the doorway of a room that smelled of old marker and institutional carpet, he looked like something the day had used hard. He looked like a man who was running a version of leadership that had worked long enough to become his only version, and something in the last week had disturbed the certainty of it in a way he hadn't expected and wasn't sure how to handle. She felt something she'd felt before in situations like this. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. She knew what it cost to have your certainty questioned. She knew it better than most. "Senior Chief," she said, "the next 2 weeks are going to be harder than this one." He looked at her. "Not for you," she said. "For the unit. I'm going to need to see things that aren't in the training logs. I'm going to need people to be honest about things they haven't been honest about, and that's going to create friction." She kept her voice level professional. "I need to know that when it does, you'll support the process. Not me. The process." He considered her for a long time. "What do you think you're going to find?" he asked. "I already know what I'm going to find," she said. "I've found it. I just need to document it." That landed. She watched it land. His jaw set, not with anger, but with the specific tension of a man who has just understood that the conversation he thought he was in control of has been running on someone else's terms. He left without answering. She closed her notebook and sat for a moment in the lamplit quiet. Outside somewhere on the facility, a night sentry was making rounds. She could hear the faint crunch of gravel at regular intervals. The facility went to sleep around it. The days ahead would be the days that mattered. Not these first ones, these had just been the opening. She'd needed Derek to see her run. She'd needed Logan to see her navigate. She'd needed Thomas to know that someone had seen him see the problem. She'd needed all 22 men to spend a week looking at her and not being able to entirely resolve what they were looking at. That was the setup. That was the groundwork. What came next was where it would actually happen. She turned off the lamp. The room went dark. She sat in it for a moment, comfortable in the dark, the way she'd learned to be comfortable in all kinds of terrain, in all kinds of silence, in all kinds of situations that other people found difficult. Then she got up and went to bed. She had 3 things to do in the morning. She wrote them in the notebook before she slept. The third thing she underlined. The 3 things she'd written in her notebook the night before were not dramatic. They never were. The first was to request the unit's last 18 months of incident logs, not the official summaries, but the raw entries, the ones that existed before someone had cleaned them up for command review. The second was to get 5 minutes alone with Garrison, the senior operator, who'd said something to Derek at dinner that made Derek's expression shift. The third was to be present at the weapons qualification block scheduled for Thursday, which Derek had not specifically invited her to attend, and had also not specifically told her she couldn't. She submitted the incident log request through the command liaison before 0700. By 7:30, she had a response telling her the request had been forwarded to Senior Chief Holloway for review. She didn't follow up on it. She let it sit. That was how you found out what something was protecting. The weapons qualification block wasn't in the building. It ran at the outdoor range on the north end of the facility, a series of static and moving target lanes that the unit used for marksmanship assessment and stress fire drills. Maya walked out there at 0815 when the first relay was already running and took a position at the observation line where the range safety officer was standing with a clipboard. The RSO glanced at her, looked at her contractor badge and went back to his clipboard. She was not his problem. Derek was running the qualification himself. He was walking the line, watching each shooter in turn, making corrections with the economy of a man who had done this thousands of times. He moved without drama. Whatever else she thought about him, he was technically competent, and she had never confused incompetence with the kind of problem she'd come here to document. The shooters were running through their qualification relays in groups of 4. She watched for the first 15 minutes without writing anything, just letting her eye calibrate to the group's baseline. Range performance was a particular kind of data. It told you things about composure under scrutiny, about how people handled the specific stress of being evaluated on a measurable standard, and about the relationship between confidence and accuracy in a context where you couldn't fake the result. She noticed 2 things inside the first relay. The first was that one of the younger operators, a man she'd seen in the nav exercise but hadn't yet spoken to directly, she'd clocked him from the roster as Specialist Ramon Diaz. 22 months in the unit, was shooting at a level that was by a significant margin the best on the line. His groupings were tight, his transitions were clean, and he shot with a stillness that was not taught in a standard qualification program. You got that stillness one of 2 ways. Either you had natural aptitude that had been carefully developed over time, or you had been somewhere that made you very good at being still under pressure. The second thing she noticed was that Derek hadn't corrected him once. Not because Diaz didn't need correction. He had a slight hitch in his reload sequence that cost him a fraction of a second per magazine change. It was minor. But Derek had stopped and corrected 2 other shooters on things that were technically less significant. He hadn't looked at Diaz's lane once. After the first relay cleared the line, Maya walked down toward the prep area where Diaz was clearing his weapon. She stopped beside him without ceremony. "Nice groupings," she said. He looked at her with the specific wariness of someone who'd been in this unit long enough to know that compliments sometimes came with a price. "Thank you, ma'am." "The reload hitch is costing you 0.3 seconds per change," she said. "Your right elbow is dropping early. You're compensating with your grip and it's working, but it'll fatigue over a long string." He looked at her. He looked at his hands, then back at her. "How'd you catch that?" he asked. "I was watching," she said. "Have you shot with a team that ran sustained fire exercises longer strings than qualification relays?" His expression did something careful. "Some," he said. "It shows," she said. "The stillness is real. That's not trained in a qualification block. Where'd you develop it?" Another careful pause. I was measuring exactly how much she already knew and how much giving her more information would cost him. "I came from a different program before this unit," he said. "What program?" "It's in my file," he said. She almost smiled. He'd given her her own line back. She noted it. "Fair enough," she said. She started to walk away and then turned back. "The hitch. Fix it in your dry fire sessions, not on the range. Work it slow." He nodded. He was still watching her when she turned away. She walked back to the observation line. The RSO hadn't moved. What she was building piece by piece, day by day, was a picture, not a report. Reports came later, when this picture was complete. Right now, she was collecting the fragments and holding them up to the light, seeing what they showed, and more importantly, what they hid. The unit had technical capability. In places, it had real capability. Diaz was not the only one. There were 3 others she'd flagged in the nav exercise, and 2 more from the communication drill, who were better than the unit's aggregate scores suggested. The unit's numbers were soft, not because the people were soft, but because something in the environment was suppressing performance consistently enough to show up in data that spanned 3 quarters. Derek's formal management of the unit was on paper correct. He ran the training schedule, he documented qualifications, he conducted reviews. Nothing in the official record was out of compliance. If you read the paperwork, you'd see a unit operating within acceptable parameters. But the paperwork didn't record what happened in the space between the official moments. It didn't record what Tomas Ruiz did at the 20-minute mark. It didn't record why Diaz shot at the top of the line and received no acknowledgement from the man running the range. It didn't record the specific quality of attention that the junior soldiers paid to Derek in group settings. Not the focused attention of people following a leader, but the cautious attention of people managing their exposure. She got her 5 minutes with Garrison on Tuesday evening. It was not planned. She found him in the tool bay where he was running maintenance on a piece of kit that didn't need maintenance. She could tell by the way he was doing it that it was the kind of methodical hands-on task that some people use to think when they can't stand still. "Warrant Garrison," she said. He looked up. He was in his mid-40s, the kind of weathered that came from actual use rather than performance of toughness, and he had eyes that calculated very quickly and betrayed almost nothing. "Ms. Reynolds," he said. She sat down on the bench across from him without asking. He didn't comment on it. "How long have you been in this unit?" she asked. 3 years, he said. "Before that?" "Different units," he said. "How does this one compare?" How was quiet for a moment, working a connector fitting in his hands, not looking at her. "That's a broad question." "You can answer it broadly," she said. He turned the fitting over. "Every unit has its thing," he said. "Some units have a talent problem. Some have a training problem. Some have a resource problem." He set the fitting down. "This unit doesn't have any of those." "What does it have?" He looked at her directly for the first time. "You know what it has," he said. "You've been here a week." "I know what I've observed," she said. "I'm asking what you've seen over 3 years." He picked up the fitting again. His hands were busy, but his voice was level. "I've seen units where people spoke up get corrected. Not for what they said. For speaking up." He paused. "I've seen performance reviews where the numbers didn't match the conversations leading up to them. I've seen people who were good at their jobs decide that being good at their jobs quietly was better than being good at their jobs visibly." He set the fitting down again. "And I've seen that compound. The way interest compounds. Slowly then, all at once. Have you raised any of this through official channels?" He gave her a look that answered the question more thoroughly than any words would have. It was the look of a man who had considered it, calculated the cost, and made a decision that he had not entirely made peace with. "That look is also data," she said quietly. Something moved across his face. Not quite guilt. Something more complicated than guilt. The particular expression of a person who had been managing a difficult situation for so long that they'd started to confuse management with acceptance. "What happens to the report?" he asked. "After you file it?" "It goes to the command. What happens after that depends on what's in it." "And what's going to be in it?" She looked at him steadily. "What needs to be in it?" He nodded slowly once. He didn't say anything else. She didn't push. She got up from the bench and walked to the door. "Ms. Reynolds," he said. She stopped. "Be careful with Derek," he said. "I don't mean that as a threat. I mean it as information." He went back to the fitting. He was a good operator. He probably still would be in the right environment. But he's been in charge here for 3 years and nobody's pushed back. That changes a person. Usually not in good ways. She stood in the doorway for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. What she didn't tell Garrison, what she didn't tell anyone in the unit, because it was not their information to have, was that she had already found 3 discrepancies in the incident logs that the command had sent her as part of the initial briefing package. Not in the raw logs she'd requested, and not yet received, but in the summaries that had been submitted to the command over the last 6 months. Small things individually. A reported near miss from a training exercise that had been categorized as equipment error in the summary, but that the raw timeline, if you looked at it carefully, pointed toward a decision made under pressure. A qualification failure that had been noted and then quietly removed from the following quarter's aggregate. A formal complaint submitted by an unnamed unit member that had been logged forwarded to unit leadership for review and had no subsequent documentation. None of these were conclusive. All of them were consistent. She was building the kind of case that didn't announce itself, the kind that didn't need to, the kind where by the time someone looked at it complete, the conclusion was not a surprise, but an inevitability. On Wednesday, Derek made the move she'd been expecting. She knew it was coming because men in his position always made it. The first week they watched. The second week, when the watching started to feel uncomfortable, they acted. It was as reliable as weather. He called a full unit meeting at 400 mandatory for all personnel, including attached observers, which technically included Maya. She was in the briefing room when the unit filed in. He waited until everyone was settled, and then he looked at her. "Ms. Reynolds," he said with the specific courtesy of someone about to use courtesy as a weapon. "Since you've been observing our training for a week, I thought it might be useful for the unit to hear your initial impressions, so they understand the purpose of the evaluation and can provide appropriate context for what you're seeing." It was cleanly done. If she declined, she looked uncooperative in front of the unit. If she spoke, he would have the opportunity to redirect, correct, or undermine anything she said in front of an audience that was already primed to defer to him. 22 men looked at her. She stood up from her chair. "Thanks for the opportunity," she said, and she meant it in a way that was not quite sarcastic, but was not quite not sarcastic either. She looked at the unit, not at Derek at the unit. "I want to be honest with you about something because I think you deserve that more than you deserve a diplomatic version." She paused a beat. "This unit has real capability. I've seen it in this room and in the field. What I've also seen is that capability isn't the unit's limiting factor right now." The room was quiet. "What I'm documenting," she continued, "is not whether individuals can do their jobs. I've seen enough to know most of you can. What I'm documenting is whether the environment here supports doing those jobs at the level the command needs and at the level you're each capable of." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Those are different questions, and they have different answers. That's all I'll say for now." She sat back down. She had given Derek nothing to correct. She had said nothing specific enough to challenge. But she had said it directly to his men, and every person in that room who had been thinking the things she was describing, which was most of them, had heard their experience reflected in a language that was careful enough not to threaten them, and precise enough to be unmistakable. Derek redirected the meeting to training schedule logistics within 30 seconds. He never gave her a speaking slot in a unit meeting again. That night at 21:30, she got a notification that her incident log request had been fulfilled. She opened the files in her room and read until 0100. She found 11 entries that didn't match their corresponding summary reports. Not dramatically, not the kind of discrepancy that screamed misconduct, the kind that whispered it, the kind that required you to read everything and hold all of it simultaneously before the pattern resolved. By the time she closed the files and went to bed, she had the shape of the thing. Not all the details, but the shape. The shape was enough to know that the next week was going to be different. Thursday's tactical simulation was the first exercise that directly involved command-level decision-making under time pressure. It was a full unit drill, all 22 personnel, running a coordinated response to a multi-stage scenario that required elements to communicate, adapt, and make decisions with incomplete information. Standard stuff for a unit at this level. The kind of exercise that, when it ran well, produced real data about how a team thought. Derek controlled the scenario parameters. He'd built the exercise himself over the previous year, running variations of it quarterly. He knew every branch point, every decision, knowed every place where the scenario could go wrong, and what a correct response looked like. He knew it the way someone knows a road they've driven 1,000 times, without looking at it, without questioning whether the road was still the right one. Maya had studied the exercise documentation the night before. She found it thorough in the areas Derek had designed it to be thorough. She also found 3 places where the scenario design, intentionally or not, prevented the exercise from testing the things the command's rubric was actually concerned with. She said nothing about this before the exercise ran. She watched it run. For the first 40 minutes, it went exactly as she expected. The elements moved, communicated, managed the first two stages cleanly. Derek was controlling the flow from the command position, feeding information through the scenario feeds, and the unit was responding to what he gave them. At the 42-minute mark, a new information input came through the scenario feed, a complication. Derek had built into the fourth stage, designed to test rapid reallocation. It was a good test. She'd noted it when she read the documentation. What happened next was not in the documentation. Thomas Ruiz, running communications on Element 2, received the new information first and identified something that the exercise documentation hadn't anticipated. The new complication, combined with a decision that had been made at the 28-minute mark, created a second-order effect that would compromise Element 4's positioning in the next stage. It wasn't obvious. It required holding two streams of information simultaneously and projecting them forward. Thomas held it for 4 seconds. She counted. She was watching him. Then he keyed his radio and said quietly but clearly, "Element 2, actual to command. I have a possible second-order effect on Element 4's current position based on the Stage 4 input. Request 60 seconds to assess." The room went still in the specific way that rooms go still when something unexpected happens. Derek's voice came back on the command channel. "Element 2, continue your assigned tasking. Stage 4 complications are managed at the command level." Tomas looked at his radio. He looked at the scenario display in front of him. He looked at the radio again. He keyed it once more. "Senior Chief, with respect, Element 4's current vector is going to intersect the new threat radius from the Stage 4 complication in approximately 4 minutes. If they don't adjust now, Element 2, Derek's voice was flat. "I said continue your assigned tasking." Tomas put the radio down. 4 minutes later, Element 4 hit the threat radius. The scenario logged a critical miss. The exercise was suspended. The debrief was tense in the way that only a room full of people who know what actually happened can be tense when the official account of what happened doesn't match. Derek ran it methodically. He identified 4 technical factors. He did not mention Tomas's radio call. Maya wrote in her notebook without looking up for most of the debrief. When Derek asked if there were any questions, she looked up. She did not ask a question. She said, "I'd like to note for the record that a communication was made on the Element 2 channel at the 42-minute mark that is relevant to the scenario outcome. I'll document it in the assessment." Every head in the room turned toward her. Derek looked at her with the specific quality of attention that meant he was deciding something. "Noted," he said. His voice was absolutely level. She closed her notebook. After the debrief, Logan Pierce found her in the hallway. He stopped in front of her with the body language of someone who had been sent to deliver a message and was enjoying the assignment. "You made it weird in there," he said. "I documented what happened," she said. "You made it a thing. It didn't need to be a thing." "It was already a thing," she said. "I just said it out loud." He looked at her with the particular frustration of someone whose best argument is that things should remain unsaid. "You're going to screw up this unit with your report. You know that everything gets harder after an investigation. Reviews, extra oversight, the command breathing down everyone's neck. You think that helps?" She looked at him steadily. "You think it's better to not know?" "I think some things run fine the way they run," he said. "Tomas Ruiz saw something real," she said. "He reported it through the right channel. He was told to stand down. 4 minutes later, the scenario failed at the exact point he predicted." She kept her voice level. "What you're describing as fine isn't fine. You've been in it long enough that it feels normal. That's different." Logan's jaw tightened. He had no answer for that. She could see him reaching for one and not finding it. "Stay out of my way," he said. "It came out small." He heard it come out small, and that made it worse. She stepped around him and walked down the hallway. He stood there for a moment. She didn't look back. That night, Derek Holloway came to the briefing room again. It was becoming a pattern, these late visits. She wondered if he was aware of that. Probably. He was not an unaware man. He sat down across from her this time without asking. "You documented the Ruiz call," he said. "Yes. You're going to make it look like I suppressed a relevant communication during a critical exercise. I documented what happened, she said. I documented the call, the response, and the outcome. The command will interpret it the way the command interprets it. You know what it's going to look like. Derek. She said his name without the rank for the first time, and it landed differently, flatter, more direct. What it looks like is what it is. Tomas Ruiz identified a second-order effect, correctly reported it correctly, and was told to stand down. 40 minutes of scenario time later, the exercise failed at exactly the point he identified. There is no way to document that accurately that doesn't look the way it looks. Because it is what it looks like. I was quiet for a moment, a long moment. He's a junior operator, Derek said. He doesn't have the full picture in a Stage 4 scenario. My job is to manage the full picture. He had the relevant picture, she said. That's different. The full picture would have helped him, but you didn't need the full picture to act on what he told you. You needed to hear it. Another silence. You've been building something, he said, since you got here. I don't know exactly what yet, but you've been building it. I've been documenting what exists, she said. There's a difference between documenting and constructing a narrative. Yes, she said. There is. Everything I have came from your unit's own records and my direct observation of your training exercises. No one has given me anything they weren't entitled to give me. No one has said anything they didn't choose to say. She looked at him. Whatever's in my report already existed before I walked through those gates. I didn't put it there. He stood. He was at the door when she said, the incident log request, the one I made Monday morning. I'd like the raw entries by end of week. He stood in the doorway with his back to her. For a long moment he didn't move. You'll have them, he said. He walked out. She sat in the quiet after he left and thought about what Garrison had told her. He was a good operator. He probably still would be in the right environment. She believed that. She had believed it from the first day, which was part of what made this hard. The hardest ones were never the people who were simply bad at their jobs. Those were almost easy. The hardest ones were the people who had genuine ability and had somewhere along the way confused their ability with their authority over other people's silence. Derek Holloway was capable. She had watched him run the range, run the exercises, move through the training cycle, with a command presence that was in isolation impressive. He had earned parts of what he was. He had also taken parts of it that he hadn't earned. And the taking had become invisible to him, which was the most dangerous kind of taking there was. On Friday morning, 3.5 hours before the scheduled end of the duty day, something happened that she had not anticipated. Tomas Ruiz walked into the briefing room and sat down across from her without knocking. She looked up from her notebook. He was in his duty uniform, and he had the look of someone who had spent the better part of 24 hours working up to something. I want to make a formal statement, he said. She set her pen down carefully. About Thursday's exercise, he said. And about some other things. Things that go back further than this week. She looked at him for a moment. You understand what a formal statement means, she said. It goes into the assessment. It's on the record. Your name is attached to it. I know, he said. Derek will know you made it. I know that too. He held her gaze. I've known what he'd think since before I made the radio call on Thursday. I made it anyway. I figure... He stopped. Looked at his hands for a second. Then back at her. I figure if I don't say it now when there's actually someone here to say it to, then I'm just deciding to keep not saying it. And I'm tired of that. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. Start from the beginning, she said. He started talking. He talked for 47 minutes. By the end, she had 6 pages of notes, and the specific feeling that comes when a shape you've been building in the dark suddenly has all its corners. She thanked him. She told him what would happen next. She told him truthfully that she didn't know exactly what the command would do with the report, but that the report would be accurate, and that his statement would be in it, and that she would not allow it to be softened. He nodded. He stood up to leave, and then stopped at the door. Why'd you come here? He asked. I mean, you could have sent a form. The command does that sometimes. Just a paper review. Why'd you actually come? She considered the question honestly. Because forms don't catch what I came here to catch, she said. And because the people inside a situation like this one usually can't fix it alone. They need someone outside it to say out loud what everyone inside already knows. He looked at her for a moment. You've been inside one before, he said. Not a question. She looked at him steadily and said nothing. He nodded once and walked out. Tomas Ruiz's 47 minutes changed the weight of everything. Not because what he said was surprising. She had already traced the outline of most of it through the incident logs, the summary discrepancies, the particular way silence moved through the unit like weather. But there is a difference between knowing the shape of a thing and hearing a person describe it from the inside. Hearing it in someone's voice with the specific hesitations and the places where they looked at their hands and the places where they didn't. That changed the texture of it. Made it real in a way that data alone never quite managed. She spent Saturday working, not at the facility. She drove 40 minutes to a diner off the interstate, sat in a corner booth for 6 hours, and organized everything she had. All 6 pages of Tomas's statement. The 11 incident log discrepancies. The timeline from Thursday's simulation. The patterns she'd observed across 2 weeks of training blocks, navigation exercises, weapons qualification, and unit briefings. She laid it out in a structure that would hold up not just to a commanding officer's reading, but to the kind of careful institutional scrutiny that came when a report touched a senior NCO with a strong performance record, because that was what this was going to touch. She'd known it from the 3rd day. The question was never whether the problem existed. The question was always whether the documentation would be airtight enough that the command couldn't look at it and choose the easier interpretation. She ordered coffee 3 times and ate nothing until 1400, and then ordered soup she barely touched. By the time she drove back to the facility, she had the structure. What she still needed was the confirmation. One piece of direct documented verifiable evidence that connected the pattern to a specific decision, not inferred, not extrapolated, but on the record, in a way that couldn't be softened in the summary. She didn't know yet where it was going to come from. She found out Monday morning. The raw incident logs. Derek had promised arrived in her secure inbox at 0612. She read them in the order they were filed, not skipping ahead, not looking for the things she already suspected. You read raw logs the way you moved through unfamiliar terrain methodically, without assuming you knew what was coming around the next turn. She found it at entry 47. It was from 14 months ago. A training accident, minor in the physical sense. A junior operator had sustained a shoulder injury during a rope descent exercise. The injury was logged, the operator was cleared for limited duty within a week, and the summary filed with the command listed the cause as equipment wear. Standard language. Nothing that would raise a flag in a routine review. But the raw entry told a different story. The raw entry included a note from the unit medic, 3 lines written in the clipped shorthand of someone documenting a treatment, not expecting anyone to read it carefully later. The note referenced a conversation. Specifically, it referenced a conversation in which the injured operator had told the medic that he had flagged a concern about the rope descent equipment to his element leader 2 days before the exercise and had been told to proceed. The element leader's name was in the medic's note. Written in shorthand, abbreviated but legible. The element leader was Logan Pierce. Logan Pierce was not the decision-maker. He would have taken that call upward. She looked at the timestamp on the medic's note and then looked at the training schedule for the 2 days preceding the exercise. She found what she was looking for in 6 minutes. There had been an equipment review session scheduled 48 hours before the descent exercise. It was listed in the training log as completed. There were no notes attached to the completion entry, no inspection record, no outcome documentation of any kind. A completed equipment review session with no record of what was reviewed. She sat with that for a moment. Then she pulled the name of the injured operator from the incident entry and cross-referenced it against the current unit roster. I was still in the unit. Specialist Calvin Marsh, 29 years old, 31 months, with Detachment 7. She had not spoken with Calvin Marsh directly. She had watched him in training. He was competent, quieter than most, with the particular quality of someone who worked hard to stay invisible in group settings. She had noted him once in the nav exercise for a navigation correction he made so smoothly that it almost didn't register, and once during the communication drill for the way he watched Derek with the specific attention of someone who had learned to read a particular kind of weather. She sent him a request through the unit's internal message system, asking if he had time to speak with her before the morning training block. He responded in 4 minutes. Yes. He came to the briefing room at 0715. He sat down with his hands folded on the table, and he looked at her. The way people look at a situation they've been waiting to arrive for a long time without fully believing it would. I need to ask you about the rope descent exercise 14 months ago, she said. The one where you injured your shoulder. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I figured that was coming, he said. What did you tell the medic? She asked. He looked at the table, then back at her. The truth, he said. I told him I'd flagged the equipment 2 days before the exercise. The main line had wear marks on the sheath. Not catastrophic, but the kind of thing you pull from rotation and inspect. Who did you flag it to? Pierce. He was running the prep for that exercise. And he said proceed. He said the equipment had been cleared in the inspection session. He said I was looking at stress marks from normal use, not structural wear. Marsh paused. I'd been in the unit 8 months at that point. Pierce had 3 years. I did the math, and I let it go. And then the exercise ran. And then the exercise ran, he said flatly. About 40 feet down the sheath on the main line failed. I caught myself on the safety, but my shoulder was already gone. I spent 6 weeks in physical therapy. She wrote. He watched her write. The incident summary said it was equipment wear, she said. I know. Did you give a statement for the official summary? I gave a statement, he said. It wasn't the statement that ended up in the summary. She looked up from her notebook. His jaw was set. Not with anger, with the specific exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was now setting it down somewhere they weren't sure was safe. What was in your statement? She asked. What I just told you, that I flagged the equipment, that I was told it had been cleared, that it hadn't been. He paused. The summary said equipment wear due to normal operational stress. The statement in the official record says the operator observed normal fatigue indicators prior to the exercise. That's not what you said. No, he said. It's not. She wrote for a moment. The room was quiet. Calvin, she said, and used his first name the way she'd used Derek's, not with familiarity, but with the particular directness that meant she was speaking to the person and not the rank. When the summary was filed, did anyone come to you to discuss the language change? He shook his head. Nobody came to me. I found out what the summary said when Garrison showed me the command response 3 weeks later. He thought I'd seen it. I hadn't. What did Garrison say? Marsh looked at the table again. He said sometimes investigations went the way they went. He said I should focus on my recovery and not... He stopped. Not make things harder on myself. She stopped writing. She looked at him. Is that what you did? She asked. He looked back at her steadily. For 14 months, he said. Yes. She finished writing his statement at 0748 and thanked him and told him the same thing she'd told Tomas Ruiz, that she didn't control what the command would do with the report, but she controlled what went into it, and what went into it would be accurate. He nodded. He stood at the door for a second, and she saw him arrange his face into the expression of someone who has done something they needed to do and is now figuring out how to walk back into the world that remains. Does Derek know, he asked, that you have the log entries? He knows I requested them, she said. He doesn't know what I found in them. He'll figure it out, Marsh said. I know, she said. He left. She sat for a moment with the weight of what she now held. 2 witness accounts. 11 documentation discrepancies. A weight of what she now held. 2 witness accounts. 11 documentation discrepancies. A physical injury that had been officially mischaracterized, a pattern of suppressed communication spanning more than a year. She had what she needed. She could file the report at the end of the week as scheduled, and the command would have enough to act on it. She could. But the week wasn't over. And something was still unresolved, not in the documentation, but in the unit itself. In the 22 men who lived inside this situation every day and would still be living inside it after she was gone, regardless of what the command did with her report. Reports fixed structures. They didn't fix what structures did to people. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. At 1100, Derek Holloway called her into his office. She had not been in his office before. It was smaller than she expected, with the focused organization of someone who maintained order, because disorder made them uncomfortable, rather than because order was the point. He was behind his desk when she came in, and he did not offer her a seat, which told her something about how he had decided to run this conversation. She sat down anyway. He looked at her for a moment, and then said, "I know what you found in the logs." She said nothing. "The Marsh incident," he said. "You've talked to him." Still nothing from her. "The summary language was a command decision," Derek said. "Not mine. The language came from above me. I filed the raw entry. The summary went through the chain and came back the way it came back. I had no control over that." She looked at him steadily. "The raw entry you filed is accurate," she said. "The medic's note is accurate. The timeline of the equipment review session is accurate. The summary is not accurate." She paused. "Did you flag the language change to anyone when the summary came back?" A silence. "Derek," she said, "did you flag it?" "I noted my concern informally," he said. "To whom?" "To my commanding officer at the time, Commander Holt." "In writing." The silence this time was longer. "No," he said. She let that sit in the room for a moment. She didn't need to say anything about it. It was already saying everything it needed to say. "You're going to put this in the report in a way that lands on me," Derek said. "I understand that. I want you to understand that there are parts of this that were not decisions I made." "I understand that," she said. "And it'll be documented accurately. All the decisions that were yours documented as yours. All the decisions that weren't documented accordingly." She looked at him. "The decisions that were yours include not documenting your informal concern about the language change. Include allowing an operating culture to develop over 3 years in which junior operators don't report problems because they've learned what happens when they do. Those decisions are yours." His jaw tightened. "I know," he said. Quiet. Just those 2 words. Something shifted in the room. Not resolution. Resolution was a long way off. But the beginning of something she'd been waiting for, which was Derek Holloway, running out of positions to defend and arriving at the territory underneath them. She stood up. "The week's not over," she said. "I still need to observe the full integration exercise on Thursday. Is there anything in that exercise that I need to know about before I observe it?" He looked up at her. He understood the question. She was giving him the opportunity to be straight with her about what she was about to see, which was also the opportunity to be straight with himself about what he'd been running. He said, "The integration exercise is the unit's strongest block. They run it well." "Good," she said. "I'll be there." She walked out. She made it to the hallway before she let out a breath she'd been managing since she sat down. That had been harder than she'd let him see. Not because she felt sorry for him. She felt something more complicated than sorry. The thing you feel when you watch a capable person account for the distance between who they could have been and who they'd become. That thing didn't have a clean name. It wasn't soft, and it wasn't hard. It was just honest. Wednesday went fast. She spent the morning in the unit's records room, cross-referencing the documentation she had with the training logs from the past 18 months, building the timeline that would anchor the report. She spent the afternoon observing a small unit communication drill that ran without significant incident, which she documented as such. She spent the evening writing. At 2000, Logan Pierce knocked on the briefing room door. She looked up. He came in and sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which was how he always entered spaces, as though the right to occupy them was assumed until someone told him otherwise. "I want to talk about the Marsh thing," he said. "Okay," she said. "I told him the equipment was cleared," Logan said. "Because I believed it was cleared. I had confirmation from the inspection log that the session was complete." "There's no record of what was inspected in that session," she said. Because the record was in the verbal debrief. We ran verbal debriefs for equipment checks at that point. It wasn't a documentation failure, it was a protocol difference. A protocol difference that resulted in a junior operator raising a concern, being told the concern was addressed, and then sustaining an injury because the concern wasn't addressed, she said. Whether you believe the equipment was cleared doesn't change that sequence. Logan's hands tightened on the edge of the table. I didn't hurt him on purpose. I know that, she said. She kept her voice even. This isn't about purpose. It's about what the environment was, whether it was set up to catch that kind of failure before it became an injury. It wasn't. She paused. Do you understand the difference between those two things? Howe was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it. The resistance first, the way it always came first, and then the thing underneath the resistance that most people spent their whole lives not letting themselves reach. He should have pushed harder, Logan said. If he really thought there was a problem, he flagged it to his element leader, she said. That was the correct channel. That was exactly what he was supposed to do. She looked at Logan. What would pushing harder have looked like going around you to Derek? And what happens when junior operators go around their element leaders to senior NCOs because they don't trust the element leader to take their concerns seriously? She let that sit. You see what I'm describing? Logan stared at the table. You've been in this unit for how long? She asked. 2.5 years, he said. And in that time, how many junior operators have come to you with a concern that you then escalated upward? He looked at her. Think about it honestly, she said. He thought. She watched him think. He said quietly, not many. Not many, she said. Why do you think that is? He had no answer. She could see him searching for one that didn't require him to look at himself and not finding it. You're not a bad person, Logan, she said. And you're not a bad operator. You're someone who learned how this unit ran with it, and running with it was easier than questioning it. She closed her notebook. That's human. But it has a cost, and Calvin Marsh's shoulder is part of that cost. He stood up. He was at the door when he stopped. What happens to me? He asked. In the report. What happened is documented, she said. What happens to you is a command decision. He nodded. He left without saying anything else. She opened her notebook again. She wrote one line and stared at it for a while. Then she went to bed. Thursday's integration exercise was the unit's capstone training event for the quarter, a full-day operation that pulled all 22 personnel into a sustained multi-phase scenario designed to test integrated decision-making under cumulative stress. It was ambitious in design, and she had to acknowledge well-constructed. Derek had built something that was, if run honestly, a genuinely rigorous assessment of where the unit stood. She observed, from the command position, alongside 2 visiting officers from the NSWC Oversight Division, Commander Patricia Voss and Lieutenant Commander James Okafor, who had arrived the night before as part of a routine quarterly visit. Their presence was coincidental. Or it appeared coincidental. She had no information either way, and she didn't try to gather any. She simply noted them in her observation log and did her job. The exercise began at 0730. For the first 2 hours, it ran cleanly. Better than clean. The unit moved through the opening phases with a coherence she hadn't seen in 2 weeks of observation, and she wrote that down accurately because accurate documentation went both ways. When people performed well, you wrote that too. At the 0943 mark, the scenario fed a new input. A complex one. A 4-layer complication that required elements to simultaneously manage a communications blackout. A personnel accountability issue in a sub-element. A change in the primary objective parameters and an unanticipated third-party variable that Derek had introduced to test adaptive response. It was the hardest thing she'd seen the unit face in 2 weeks. What happened in the next 11 minutes was the thing that pulled all of it together. Ramon Diaz running point on Element 1 hit the communications blackout first. He managed it correctly, went to backup protocols, maintained element cohesion, continued moving. But 30 seconds into the blackout, he received the objective parameter change through the backup channel and immediately identified a conflict between the new parameters and the current positioning of Element 3. High-mod a decision. He didn't wait for command clearance. He redirected his element's movement to a position that would cover Element 3's gap, while sending a runner, an actual physical runner, in an exercise with degraded communications, which was the correct call to relay his analysis to the command position. Derek received the runner's message at the 0952 mark. He looked at the message. He looked at the scenario board. He looked at the command channel feeds. And then he did something that Maya had not expected. He adapted. He updated the command positioning in response to Diaz's assessment. He communicated the change through the backup channel to the affected elements. He incorporated the information from a junior operator into his command decision in real time without hesitation. The scenario continued. 14 minutes later, the integration exercise reached its conclusion. All elements at objective within scenario parameters without a critical miss. The unit gathered for the debrief. Commander Voss and Lieutenant Commander Okafor stood to one side. Maya stood near them, her notebook in hand. Derek ran the debrief. He was methodical as always. He went through the phases, the decision points, the technical elements. And then he stopped. He stopped in a place that wasn't on the standard debrief template. He said at 0952, I received an assessment from Element 1 through a non-standard communication method. It was accurate. It affected my command decision in a way that improved the outcome. He looked at Diaz across the group. That was the right call, the assessment, the method, and the action. The room was very quiet. Diaz said nothing, but something in his posture changed. Derek continued the debrief. He finished it. He dismissed the unit to lunch. Commander Voss came up beside Maya as the room cleared. Good exercise, Voss said. It was, Maya said. Your evaluations filing end of week. Yes, ma'am. Voss looked at her for a moment, with the particular attention of a senior officer who has read enough assessment files to know when there's more in one than the standard template accounts for. Anything we should be aware of before the formal submission? Maya looked at her steadily. The report will be thorough, she said. I'd recommend the command read the full version before acting on the summary. Voss held her gaze for a moment, nodded once. She walked away. Okafor, who had been standing half a step back, said quietly, She'll read it. You can count on that. Maya looked at him. He had the look of someone who had sent this kind of report before. Who knew what came after it? Whatever's in there, he said, write it cleanly. Don't editorialize. Let the facts do it. That's how I write, she said. He nodded. Good, he said, and walked after Voss. She stood in the emptying room for a moment. On the scenario board, the final positions were still marked. Element 1 at objective. Element 3 covered. The critical miss column 0. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to write the report. She worked through Thursday night. She was still working at 0200 on Friday, and she allowed herself 4 hours of sleep and started again at 0600. The report was 43 pages when it was complete. She read it through twice and changed 17 words. Not for softness, for precision. She took out 2 adjectives that were accurate but unnecessary and replaced 2 passive constructions with active ones, because passive constructions in a document like this could become exits for the people responsible. She submitted it at 1347 on Friday. At 1600, she was packing her bag in the visiting quarters when Derek Holloway knocked on the open door. She looked up. He stood in the doorway. He was off duty. No cover, no duty belt, just his uniform with the rank on it that she'd been looking at for 3 weeks. He looked like someone who had just gotten off a very long road and was still figuring out that they'd stopped moving. I know you filed it, he said. This afternoon, she said. You're leaving today. Tonight, she said. He came into the room a few steps and stopped. I need to ask you something. Okay. The things in the report, he said. The documentation discrepancies. The Marsh summary. The patterns you documented. He paused. Did you? He stopped again. Started over. Is there anything in there that's wrong? She straightened. She looked at him directly. No, she said. There's nothing in it that's wrong. He nodded slowly. He wasn't looking for a different answer. She understood that. He was looking for the experience of hearing the answer, said aloud clearly, by someone who had no stake in protecting it. "Okay," he said. She went back to her bag. "The exercise Thursday," he said. "The Diaz call. I've been running that debrief format for 2 years, and I've never broken from the template before." She didn't look up from the bag. "I know," she said. "What made you think I would?" She thought about that for a moment. "I didn't know you would," she said. "I hoped you might. That's different." A pause. "I've been doing this for 17 years, he said. "I wasn't always." He stopped. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him in the doorway, not moving, the specific sound of someone standing inside a difficult truth and not running from it. "Is there anything in the report about Thursday?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I documented what happened at 0952. The decision you made. The way you ran the debrief." She looked up at him. "It's in there." He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a word for. Not relief. Something older than relief. "Thank you," he said. He left. She finished packing. She stood in the room for a moment after the bag was zipped in the institutional quiet of a space that had briefly held something significant and was already going back to being a room. She picked up her bag. She turned off the lamp. She walked down the hallway and out through the main doors, past the duty officer at the front desk, who looked up and then went back to his paperwork, across the parking lot to the same sedan she'd parked there 3 weeks ago. She put the bag in the back. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off for a moment, looking at the facility through the windshield. She thought about Tomas Ruiz. She thought about Calvin Marsh. She thought about Ramon Diaz, standing at the weapons line with his reload hitch and his stillness that didn't come from a qualification program. She thought about Garrison in the tool bay, with his hands busy and his voice level. She thought about Logan Pierce standing in the hallway saying "you made it weird," and the way he'd sounded smaller than he'd meant to. She thought about Derek Holloway, standing in a doorway at 1600, asking if there was anything in the report that was wrong. She started the engine. She drove out through the gates. Behind her, the facility went back to what it was. 22 men in a unit that had in the last 3 weeks been watched by someone who actually saw it. Not a threat. Not an inspection. Just someone who had looked at the whole thing and written down what was there. What happened next was the command's decision. But the first decision, the one that made all other decisions possible, had already been made. In a briefing room. By a junior operator who was tired of choosing silence. And by a woman with a small bag and worn boots who had walked through those gates 3 weeks ago and started writing. The command's response came 11 days after Maya filed the report. She was not at the facility when it arrived. She was 400 miles away in a different city, observing a different unit with a different set of problems that rhymed in the way. All institutional problems. Rhyme different notes. Same song. She got the notification on her phone at 0714 on a Tuesday morning. A brief message from the NSWC liaison office, informing her that the report had been reviewed by Commander Voss and forwarded to the Naval Special Warfare Command Inspector General's office for formal review. The message included one additional line: her testimony would be requested as part of the formal proceeding. She read it twice. She put her phone in her pocket. She went back to work. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing from 400 miles away, was what was happening inside Detachment 7 at the exact moment that message reached her phone. She found out later. From Garrison. He called her 3 weeks after she left on a Thursday evening and talked for 22 minutes in the measured, careful voice of a man choosing his words, not because he was hiding anything, but because he understood that precision mattered. He told her the command's notification had arrived at the facility on a Monday. Derek had been informed at 0800. By 0855, the unit knew not from Derek, but in the way units always know things, through the specific atmospheric shift that happens when something significant lands on the leadership and the leadership doesn't yet know how to carry it. By 0900, the unit was in formation for morning training, and Derek ran it. He ran it the way he always ran it because that was the kind of man he was, the kind who showed up regardless. But Garrison said the men watched him differently that morning. Not with the anticipatory attention of people waiting for something dramatic. With the careful attention of people who were trying to figure out what came next and had no map for it. Logan Pierce did not come to PT. He called in with a non-specific duty conflict. It was the first time in 14 months he had missed a morning formation without a documented reason. Tomas Ruiz came. He ran in the back third of the formation, same as always. But he ran, and when the formation was done and the unit broke for the day's first training block, he stopped by Garrison's position and said, quiet enough that only Garrison heard, "Did you know she was going to actually do something with it?" Garrison had said, "She told you she would." Tomas had said, "People say things." Garrison had said, "Some people mean them." Maya listened to all of this on the phone in a parking lot sitting in a rental car with the engine off, and she held the phone against her ear and didn't say anything for a moment after Garrison finished that part. "How's Marsh?" she asked. "Working," Garrison said. "He's been quieter since you left. But it's a different kind of quiet, not the kind he had before." She understood what he meant. The quiet before was the quiet of suppression of a person holding something down that wanted to surface. The quiet after was something else. The quiet of a person who had spoken and was now waiting to see what the words produced. "And Derek?" she asked. Garrison took a breath. He requested a meeting with Commander Voss the day after the IG notification. I don't know what was said in that meeting, but when he came out of it, he went straight to the unit records room and spent 4 hours in there. A pause. Alone. She thought about what that meant. She had some ideas. "He's pulling documentation," she said. "That's what I think," Garrison said. "I don't know if he's building a defense or trying to understand something. Maybe both." "Maybe both," she agreed. There was a silence on the line. Not uncomfortable. The kind that two people who have understood each other quickly sit in without needing to fill it. "She did something in there," Garrison said finally. "Whatever happens with the formal review, she already did something in there. I want you to know I can see that." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for what you told me. In the tool bay." "It was just information," he said. "It was the right information at the right time," she said. "That's not nothing." She drove back to her hotel and sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Detachment 7 for a long time. Not with worry exactly. With the specific kind of attention you give to something you've set in motion and can no longer control, which is not the same as helplessness. It was more like watching weather move across a valley from a high enough position that you couldn't stop it and didn't need to. It was going to do what it was going to do. You just hoped you'd read it right. She had 2 days before she was due in Washington. She spent them writing. The IG proceeding was not a trial. It was a formal administrative review, which was a quieter and more thorough thing than a trial, and for the people inside it, often harder to navigate. Trials had rules about what was allowed. Administrative reviews asked questions until they had the full picture and then made determinations that traveled up and down the chain of command in ways that weren't always visible until they arrived somewhere. Maya testified on a Wednesday. The room was smaller than she expected and more formal than she wanted, with a stenographer and 2 IG investigators who had clearly read the report and had specific questions about specific entries. They asked her about the incident log discrepancies. She answered with dates, entry numbers, and the specific language differences between the raw logs and the command summaries. They asked her about Tomas Ruiz's radio call during the Thursday simulation. She described with the precision of someone who had been trained to observe and document under conditions where getting the detail wrong had consequences. They asked her about Calvin Marsh. She gave them his statement, the medic's note, the training schedule, cross-reference, and the timeline she had built in the diner 40 minutes from the facility. She gave it to them in order without editorializing because Okafor had been right. The facts did it. They didn't need her to. One of the investigators, the senior one, a woman in her 50s named Chen, who had the particular quality of someone who had heard a great many institutional stories and had stopped being surprised by any of them, asked at the end of Maya's testimony, "Is there anything in the assessment you'd change now, having been through this proceeding?" Maya thought about it honestly. 17 words, she said. Chen looked at her. Which ones? I changed them before I filed it, Maya said. I'd change them back. Chen's expression didn't shift, but something in her eyes did. Were they softer the first way? Slightly, Maya said. Why'd you change them? Because I thought precision mattered more than impact, Maya said. I still think that, but I'd go back to the first version because it was more accurate. Chen made a note. She said, "Thank you, Ms. Reynolds." She looked up. "We may reach out with additional questions. You have my contact information," Maya said. She walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk in the November air for a moment, and she thought, as she sometimes did in moments like this, about the version of herself that had existed before all of it. Before the years that had made her good at what she was good at. Before the training and the deployments and the things she'd seen in places that had no names on maps people used in ordinary life. That version of herself had not been weak. She wanted to be clear about that even to herself. That version had been someone else in a different set of circumstances, learning a different set of things. The woman she was now had come from that one, not replaced her. She walked to the car. She had 3 calls to make before the afternoon was done. The IG's formal findings were released 6 weeks after the proceeding. Maya was not at the facility when they arrived there either. She was in her apartment, a spare, organized place in Northern Virginia that she occupied more as a base of operations than a home, when the official summary reached her email at 11:22 on a Friday morning. She read it carefully. The findings were not dramatic in the way that dramatic things announce themselves. They were thorough, which was better. They documented the systemic leadership culture deficiencies in Detachment 7, going back 22 months, noting specifically that the pattern of suppressed communication had been allowed to compound without intervention from unit leadership. They noted the documentation discrepancies in 4 of the 11 entries she had flagged and recommended a formal audit of the unit's incident reporting procedures for the preceding 2 years. They noted the Marsh incident and the language change in the official summary, and recommended a specific corrective action for the chain of command members who had been responsible for that summary. Commander Holt, who had been Derek's commanding officer at the time of the Marsh incident and had since moved to a staff position at the NSWC, was directed to submit a formal written explanation. His response was required within 30 days. Derek Holloway was not removed from command. She read that line twice and then sat back. Howe was issued a formal letter of counseling, serious a record that would follow him, and directed to complete a leadership development program specifically designed for senior NCOs with command authority. He was also required to submit to a quarterly command climate review for the following 18 months, with results going directly to the Oversight Division. Garrison's note was not disciplined. Logan Pierce received a written counseling. Calvin Marsh's incident record was corrected officially, with a notation that the original summary did not accurately reflect the circumstances of the injury. She sat with all of it. It was not everything. It never was. The gap between what happened and what the institution was able to formally acknowledge and correct was always real. She had known it going in, and she knew it now. The question was never whether the institution would produce a perfect result. The question was whether the institution would produce a real one. This was real. She closed the email and made a call. Tomas Ruiz picked up on the second ring. She could hear in the background the particular ambient sound of a military installation, distant machinery, the echo of voices in a large space. "You heard," she said. "Word got around about an hour ago," he said. "Garrison told us." "How's the unit taking it?" A pause. Not a hesitant one, a considering one. "Better than I expected," he said. "Some guys are pissed, the ones who were closest to Derek. Logan barely came in today." Another pause. "But the younger guys—" He stopped. "It's strange. They seem lighter, like something they were carrying got put down somewhere." She understood that. "How are you?" "Good," he said. It came out with the specific simplicity of someone for whom that word in this context carries a lot of weight. "I'm good, really." "Marsh. He went for a run this morning," Tomas said. "Which doesn't sound like much, but he hasn't run voluntarily since before the injury. I think—" He paused. I think knowing it's in the record the right way matters to him more than he expected. She thought about Calvin Marsh at the equipment line, looking at a rope with wear marks on the sheath, doing the math between what he knew and what he'd been told, and choosing to believe the person with more time in the unit over the evidence in front of his own eyes. It cost him 6 weeks in physical therapy and 14 months of carrying a version of events that wasn't true. Getting the record corrected wouldn't uninjure his shoulder, but it would unfalsify the story of how it happened. That was not nothing. That was, for some people, the most important thing. "Tomas," she said, "what you did in that room 3 weeks ago, sitting down and talking for 47 minutes, that took more than most people manage." "You were easy to talk to," he said. "You would have done it with anyone who came through those doors and actually listened," she said. "You were just waiting for someone who would." A silence. "Maybe," he said. "Yeah, maybe." She said goodbye and ended the call. She sat for a while. Then she called someone else. Derek Holloway picked up on the 4th ring. He sounded like someone who had been awake for a long time. "Ms. Reynolds," he said. "Derek," she said. "I assume you've seen the findings." "Yes." A pause. She waited. She had learned early, and at some cost, that the impulse to fill silences was one of the most reliable ways to miss what a silence was trying to say. "They didn't remove me," he said. "No," she said. "I thought they might." "I know." Another silence. Longer. "Was that in your report?" he asked. "A recommendation about my command status?" "No," she said. "It wasn't my call to make. I documented what I found. What to do with it was the command's decision." "But you had an opinion," he said. "It wasn't an accusation. It was a question." She thought about how to answer it honestly. "I had an observation," she said. "What I observed in 3 weeks was a man who understood what accountability looked like by the end of it, even when it was pointed directly at him. That's not nothing. A lot of people in your position don't get there." She paused. "What you do with the next 18 months is the answer to every question anyone might have about what you're worth in command." He was quiet for a long moment. "The leadership program," he said. "The quarterly reviews." "Yes. That's not—" He stopped, started again. "I've been in the Navy for 17 years. I know what those processes look like from the inside. They can be genuine, or they can be ornamental," she said. "Yeah. Which one it is depends on you," she said. "Not on the process." He said nothing for a moment. "You knew what you were doing," he said. "From the first day. The way you moved through the unit. You weren't just documenting." "I was documenting," she said. "You were also—" He paused, looking for the word. "You were also teaching. Every time you said something to Ruiz or Marsh or Diaz. The way you ran that debrief question at the Wednesday drill. You were teaching the unit how to be different before the report was even filed." She thought about that. It was more accurate than she'd have admitted at the time. "Maybe," she said. "Yes." "Why?" he asked. "That's beyond your assignment." She considered the question. It deserved a real answer. "Because the report fixes the record," she said. "It doesn't fix the people. And the people are going to be in that unit after the review is done, after the quarterly assessments. Normalize after the command moves on to the next thing. If the people don't know something different from what they knew before I got there, then I've documented a problem without doing anything about it." She paused. That felt like not enough. A long silence. "Reynolds," he said, "where did you serve before all this?" She looked at the window. The sky was the specific gray-white of mid-November. "It's in my contractor file," she said. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Still," he said. "Still," she said. A pause. Then he said, "Thank you for what you wrote. The part about Thursday. It happened," she said. "It went in. I know. But it mattered. That it went in." His voice was different from what it had been 3 weeks ago. Not softer exactly. Something had been subtracted from it, the specific hardness that came from years of never being wrong in front of the people you were responsible for. The hardness that looked like strength until it didn't. "I've been thinking about Diaz," he said. "The call he made. I've been in situations where a junior operator read something I didn't read. In 17 years. He paused. "I can think of 2 times, maybe 3. And," she said, "and I can think of how many times I shut down the communication before it got to me," he said quietly. "That's the part I keep coming back to." She didn't say anything. She let it sit exactly where he'd put it. "The leadership program starts in January," he said. "I know. I'm going to do it like it means something," he said. "Not because the command is watching, because—" He stopped. "Because you know what it costs when you don't," she said. "Yeah," he said, "because I know what it costs." She ended the call at 13:47. She sat in the apartment for a while. Outside, a car passed on the street below. A door closed somewhere in the building. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon doing what ordinary afternoons did. She thought about the first day. The way he'd yanked her arm in front of 200 soldiers and told them to get her out of his sight. The way the training ground had gone quiet with the particular quiet of a crowd watching someone choose a target. She thought about standing in that moment and not pulling her arm free and not raising her voice. Just letting go slowly and looking at him the way you look at something you've already decided how to handle. He hadn't known what that look meant then. He knew now. The question she had never allowed herself to engage with during the 3 weeks at the facility was the one she allowed herself now, sitting alone in her apartment, with the calls made and the report filed and the findings issued. Had she been the right person to send? Not because of her age or her appearance, or the way Derek Holloway and Logan Pierce and half the unit had looked at her when she walked across that training ground on day 1. That part had never concerned her. She had stopped being concerned by that category of underestimation a long time ago, in circumstances that had made this assignment look by comparison almost comfortable. But because she had history with what she'd found in that unit. Not with Detachment 7 specifically. With the shape of it. With the specific way institutions close around a problem and make it invisible, the way people inside them learn to keep the peace by keeping silent, the way the silence compounds until someone gets hurt, and the hurt is written down wrong, and the wrong version becomes the official one. She had lived inside a version of that, years ago. In a context she never discussed, and that was not in her contractor file, and that had been the real reason underneath all the professional reasons that she had walked through those gates and not sent a form. Because forms didn't catch what she'd come to catch. Because she knew what it felt like to be the person who saw the problem and did the math, this much knowledge against that much authority, and chose the wrong answer. She had chosen the wrong answer once. Not in the military. Before. And it had cost her something she still thought about in the specific way you think about the things you can't undo. Not with debilitating guilt. With the persistent, honest awareness that it had happened and that it had mattered, and that the best she could do with it was carry it forward into the work. That was what she'd done for 3 weeks in that facility. Carried it forward. Tomas Ruiz had spent 47 minutes telling her the truth, and she had written it down accurately. And now Calvin Marsh's injury was on the record the right way. That was something. It was not everything, and it did not undo the year he'd spent carrying the wrong version. But it was something real, which was the most she'd been able to promise anyone going in. She opened her laptop. She had a new assignment request, waiting a different facility, different unit, a different set of quarterly metrics that the command had flagged for review. The request had come in the same day the IG findings were released. She had noticed the timing and filed it as potentially significant and then let it go because possibly significant things had to wait until the immediate things were done. She read the request through. Different notes. Same song. She started drafting her response. She was halfway through it when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. She picked it up and looked at the screen. It was from a number she didn't recognize. 5 words. Marsh ran 6 miles today. She stared at it for a moment. Then she set the phone down, and she looked at the wall for a while, and she felt something that she wasn't going to name, because naming it would make it smaller than it was. She picked up the phone again. She typed 2 words back. Good, she said. Good. She sent it. She went back to the draft. Outside November was doing what November did. The day was moving toward the particular early dark of that month, the kind that arrived before you were ready for it and reminded you that readiness was not actually a prerequisite for things happening. Things happened when they happened. You did the work ahead of time as thoroughly as you could, and then you watched what the work produced, and you adjusted, and you started again. She had learned that the hard way. She had learned most things the hard way. That was fine. The hard way was thorough. It left marks, but the marks were information, and information was what she was best at working with. She finished the draft and sent it. She closed the laptop. She sat for a while longer in the apartment that was a base of operations, more than a home, and she thought about 22 men in a unit in Virginia who were at this moment living inside the aftermath of something she had set in motion. Some of them were angry. Some of them were relieved. Some of them were figuring out for the first time that the way things had been running was not the same as the way things had to run. That last group, that was the one that mattered. She didn't know how many of them were in it. She wouldn't know for months, maybe longer. The real result of this kind of work didn't show up in the formal findings or the corrective action documentation. It showed up later quietly in the decisions people made when nobody was watching. In whether Tomas Ruiz keyed his radio the next time he saw something real. In whether the next junior operator who flagged a concern to Logan Pierce got heard. In whether Derek Holloway sat in a leadership development session in January with his arms crossed marking time or with his notebook open and his pen moving. She couldn't control any of that. She had never been able to control any of that. What she could control was whether the work she did was accurate, thorough, and honest, and whether she showed up for the next one, ready to do it again. She was. The assignment request was sitting in her sent folder response submitted, waiting for confirmation. She would hear back by Monday. She got up, made coffee, and stood at the window with the cup in both hands, watching the street below go through its ordinary afternoon business, and she thought, as she sometimes did, when a long thing was finally over, about the first moment. About a training ground in Virginia, and a man's hand on her arm, and a crowd holding its breath. About letting go slowly. About the look on his face when he realized the look on her face meant something he didn't yet understand. She drank her coffee. She had work to do. The confirmation came back on Monday as she'd expected. New facility. New unit. Different state. Different command structure. Different set of quarterly flags that translated in the language she'd learned to read into the same underlying question. What is actually happening inside this unit that the paperwork isn't showing? She accepted the assignment, filed her availability, and spent Tuesday making the specific kind of preparations that people who do this work make. Not packing, not logistics, but the internal preparation of someone clearing space for a new set of people with a new set of problems that would require her full attention. She was good at clearing space. She had practiced it for years. What she had not practiced and could not quite clear was the particular quality of unfinished attention she still held toward Detachment 7. Not worry, not regret. Something more like the feeling of having read a book and set it down before the last chapter, knowing the chapter was being written without her, and would finish the way it would finish regardless. She told herself to let it go. She mostly succeeded. Then Garrison called again on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the IG findings, and what he told her made her sit down on the edge of her bed at 0930 and not move for a while. Derek Holloway had requested a unit-wide meeting. Not a training block, not a debrief, not a standard formation. A meeting. He had sent the request through administrative channels, the same way any other meeting was scheduled, and the only additional notation was that attendance was required, and that the meeting was not related to any training event. Garrison said the unit had spent 48 hours speculating about what it was. What did they think it was? Maya asked. Everything, Garrison said. Some guys thought he was going to resign. Some thought he was going to come in, swinging blame the report, blame the process, dig in. Logan thought the command had told him to make a formal apology. A pause. Logan was hoping for that one, actually. The formal apology version. That would have let everyone know it was mandatory and not real. What was it? She asked. Garrison was quiet for a moment. It wasn't any of those things, he said. Derek had walked into the unit meeting room at 0900 on a Tuesday, and stood at the front without a presentation, without notes, without the particular armor of structure that people use when they need to get through something difficult. He stood there the way a person stands when they have decided the only way through is straight through. He talked for 31 minutes. Garrison recounted it in pieces, the way you recount something that hit you hard enough that you absorbed it unevenly. Some parts verbatim, some parts paraphrased, some parts described only as impressions, because the words hadn't fully resolved into memory yet. Derek said he had spent 22 years doing a version of leadership that worked in certain conditions and failed in others, and that he had not been able to see clearly which conditions he was actually in, because the environment around him had stopped giving him honest feedback a long time ago. He said he understood now that this was partly the environment's failure, and largely his own, that he had built the environment, or allowed it to be built around him, in ways that made honest feedback expensive enough that people stopped offering it. He named Calvin Marsh by name. He said what had happened to Marsh was wrong, not because the injury was necessarily preventable. He didn't know if it was, but because the record of it had been allowed to be wrong, and he had not fought hard enough to correct it. He said that 14 months of a man carrying a false account of his own injury was something that happened on his watch and would remain on his watch regardless of where the paper trail went above him. He named Tomas Ruiz by name. He said that the radio call at the 42-minute mark of the Thursday simulation was the correct call, the right channel, the right action, and that his response to it had been wrong. He said he had been managing the scenario from a command perspective that prioritized his own oversight of the full picture over the possibility that someone further down the chain might have seen something he'd missed. He said that was an error in his thinking that had cost the exercise outcome, and more importantly, had cost Tomas something he couldn't fully quantify: the experience of doing the right thing and being told to stand down. He did not apologize in the broad, untextured way that apologies become meaningless. He was specific. Each acknowledgement was attached to a specific event, a specific person, a specific consequence. It was, Garrison said, the most uncomfortable thing he had witnessed in 3 years with that unit, and also the most honest. At the end of it, Derek said something that Garrison gave her verbatim, because it was the kind of line that stayed. He said, "I am not asking you to trust me. Trust is earned over time, and I have spent time earning the wrong things. What I am asking is that you hold me to a different standard starting now. Not an easy standard. The real one. If I fall short of it, I need you to say so. Through the right channels, the right way. And I need to be the kind of leader who hears it when you do. That is what I am going to try to be. You will be the ones who know if I'm succeeding." Garrison stopped talking. Maya sat on the edge of the bed and said nothing for a moment. "How did the unit respond?" she asked. "Quiet," Garrison said. "A long quiet. Then Martinez, one of the younger guys, he's been in the unit 8 months. You barely interacted with him," he said. "Roger that, Senior Chief." Just that. And it wasn't sarcastic. It was, I don't know. It was like he was answering seriously because he'd decided the question deserved a serious answer. She pressed her palm flat on the bedspread and held it there. "And Logan," she said. A pause. "Logan didn't say anything in the meeting," Garrison said. "He left right after. I found him in the equipment bay about an hour later. He was doing maintenance. Same thing you found me doing, probably. Keeping his hands busy." Another pause. "He asked me if I thought Derek meant it." "What did you say?" "I said I thought he meant it enough that it mattered whether it was true, and that was different from last month." She almost smiled. "That's a careful answer." "It was a careful question," Garrison said. She stood up. She walked to the window. Outside, the December sky was low and white, the specific color of a cold that hadn't committed to snow yet. "Garrison," she said, "thank you for telling me." "Thought you should know," he said, "since you're the one who started it." "Thomas started it," she said. "He was the one who sat down and talked." "Thomas sat down because you made it safe to sit down," Garrison said. "There's a difference. You know there is." She did know. She didn't argue with him. She stood at the window for a long time after the call ended, holding the phone in her hand, and she thought about Derek Holloway standing at the front of a room without notes and talking for 31 minutes about the specific and measurable ways he had been wrong. She thought about what that cost. Not the institutional cost. The command already knew what it knew. The quarterly reviews were in place. The letter of counseling was in the file. The personal cost. The cost of standing in front of 22 people, some of whom were angry at you, some of whom were relieved, some of whom were watching with the cautious attention of people who had been burned before and weren't ready to stop protecting themselves and saying, "Here is where I failed specifically, and here is the person who paid for it." She had sat in that briefing room 3 weeks and listened to him defend himself, maneuver, rationalize, and finally on the last night arrive at something that was not quite there yet, but was facing the right direction. She had watched it happen slowly, the way most real things happened. Not a moment of transformation. A series of moments, each one smaller than it looked, that accumulated into a direction. The question she had asked herself from day one was whether Derek Holloway was salvageable. Not for her sake. For the sake of the 22 men who would spend the next years of their careers under his command, or someone else's learning from someone what leadership was supposed to look like. She had filed the report honestly. She had documented what existed. She had not recommended his removal, because what she had seen in the last week told her the answer to that question was more complicated than removal, and the command was better positioned than she was to weigh what came next. What came next, apparently, was 31 minutes without notes. It wasn't everything. It was real. She put her phone in her pocket and went to finish packing for the new assignment. She was in the new facility for 3 weeks before anything connected the two assignments in a way she hadn't expected. It came through an official channel, a message from the NSWC liaison office, copied to her contractor file, noting that her evaluation of Detachment 7 had been selected as a case study for a command-wide leadership development curriculum being developed for the following year's Senior NCO program. The message was brief and administrative. It did not name names. It described the evaluation in institutional language. Assessment of systemic communication suppression within a high-functioning tactical unit. That was accurate and felt nothing like the 3 weeks she had actually lived. She read it twice. She filed it. She went back to work. What she didn't expect was the call she got 4 days later from a number she recognized: Commander Patricia Voss. "Ms. Reynolds," Voss said. "Commander Maya said, I imagine you saw the curriculum notification." "I did." "I wanted you to hear directly that it was my recommendation," Voss said. "Not the IG's, mine. The way you ran that evaluation, the documentation, the methodology, the way you handled the unit personnel is the model we should be teaching. Not as an abstract, as a case." Maya was quiet for a moment. "With respect, Commander," she said, "the way the unit personnel handled it is the model worth teaching. I documented. They spoke." A pause on the line. "That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about," Voss said. "That distinction. Most evaluators don't make it." Another pause. "There's a conversation I'd like to have with you about a larger role within the Performance Liaison program. Not immediately. When your current assignment wraps. Would you be open to that conversation?" She looked at the wall of her temporary quarters. The same institutional beige, different facility, same quality of waiting silence. "I'd be open to it," she said. "Good," Voss said. "I'll be in touch." The call ended. She sat with it for a minute. Then she picked up her notebook and went back to work, because the unit she was currently embedded with had its own problems, its own silences, its own junior operators doing math in their heads about whether speaking was worth the cost, and they deserved her full attention. She gave it to them. The call from Tomas Ruiz came on a Thursday evening in January, 2 weeks into the new year, while she was in an airport waiting for a connection. She picked up immediately. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. "How's the unit?" "Different," he said. And then he said it again differently. "Different." She could hear the specificity in how he used the word, both times the first one factual, the second one something more personal. "Derek ran the communication drill today," Thomas said. "The same format as the one in your second week. The one where I—" He paused. "The one where I didn't key the radio the first time." "I remember," she said. At the 30-minute mark, I caught a discrepancy in the scenario feed. Same kind of thing. Second-order effect, downstream impact, not obvious, unless you were watching both channels simultaneously. He paused. I keyed the radio. She said nothing. She waited. He listened, Tomas said. He asked me 2 questions about my assessment. I answered them, and he incorporated the information into the command decision. The scenario didn't fail. A longer pause. Afterward in the debrief, he said in front of the whole unit that the catch at the 30-minute mark was the reason the exercise ended the way it ended. The airport moved around her. Announcements in the distance, people with rolling luggage, the particular noise of a public space that had no awareness of anything happening in it. How did that feel? She asked. Tomas was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that means someone is being honest with themselves before they answer. Like the first time in 2 years I wasn't doing math, he said. You know that math. Is it worth it? What does it cost? What happens if I'm wrong and he shuts me down again? His voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath it. Not fragility, but the specific weight of something that had been carried a long time and was only now being set down for real. There was no math today. I just keyed the radio. She sat with that. That's what it's supposed to feel like, she said. Yeah, he said. I figured. She boarded her flight 20 minutes later and sat in the window seat and looked at the dark outside and thought about a unit in Virginia running a communication drill on a Thursday with no math in it. She thought about the specific cost of math, the years of it, the calibration that happened inside people when their environment told them over and over that speaking was more expensive than silence, the way it changed, not just what they said, but how they thought, the way it pruned their instincts until they stopped noticing what they were no longer noticing. She thought about what it took to unlearn that, how long it took, how much repetition, how many times Tomas Ruiz would have to key the radio and be heard before the math stopped running automatically, before his first instinct stopped being calculation and went back to being perception. She had no way to know. Some things took longer than you expected. Some things happened faster. The work was never finished in the neat way that reports were finished. It went on past the documentation, past the findings, past the 31 minutes without notes. It went on in the daily decisions of 22 men who would carry what they'd learned in Detachment 7 into every unit they worked with for the rest of their careers. That was the real distribution, not the curriculum, not the case study, the people. She closed her eyes and let the flight take her forward. 6 months after she left Detachment 7. Maya Reynolds received a letter. Not an email. A letter physical mailed to the NSWC Performance Liaison Program Office and forwarded to her. The envelope was plain. The handwriting on the outside was careful in the specific way of someone who didn't write by hand often and wanted to get it right. Inside was a single page. Calvin Marsh had written it. She read it standing at her kitchen counter at 0715, on a Tuesday morning, still in the clothes she'd slept in, coffee going cold beside her. He wrote that he had been uncertain for the first several weeks after the IG findings, whether the corrected record would change anything he actually felt. He wrote that he had thought about it the way you think about a debt being forgiven, theoretically meaningful, practically unclear in its impact on the daily weight of things. He wrote that he had been wrong about that. He wrote that the morning he got the official notification that his incident record had been corrected, he had gone for a run. Not because he planned to. He just got up and went. He ran 6 miles and didn't stop until he was genuinely out of breath, which was the first time since the injury that he had tested himself against his own limits, without the injury being the limit. He wrote that he understood this was probably just physiology, that his shoulder was healed and his body had been ready, and the psychological release of the corrected record had simply unlocked something that was already there. He wrote that he didn't entirely think it was just physiology. Toward the end of the letter, he wrote one paragraph that she read 3 times. He wrote, "I thought for a long time that what I needed was for someone to punish the people who got it wrong. I wanted consequences in the visible, formal sense. What I found was that the thing I actually needed was for someone to say on the official record in language that couldn't be revised or summarized away, that what I said happened is what happened." that the wear marks were real, that I reported them, that the injury was the result. Just that those things are true, and the record says they are true. I didn't know how much that would matter until it did. She put the letter down. She picked up her coffee. She drank it cold, standing at the counter. She thought about a medic's note written in shorthand. 3 lines. Not expecting anyone to read it carefully. She thought about entry 47 in a raw incident log, and what it had taken to find it, and what it had taken to follow it to where it led. She thought about an evidence chain built not from dramatic discovery, but from the slow, methodical reading of documents that told a different story than the summaries sitting on top of them. She thought about a woman in her early 20s years ago who had seen something wrong inside an institution and had done the math and chosen silence, and had carried that choice for long enough that the weight of it had eventually become indistinguishable from her own bones. She had not gone into Detachment 7 to fix that. That was not the assignment, and that was not the work. But it had shaped how she did the work. It had shaped the patience of it, the specificity of it, the commitment to documentation over drama, to the accurate record over the satisfying narrative. It had shaped the choice to sit with Tomas Ruiz for 47 minutes and write everything down and tell him she wouldn't soften it. She had been the person who finally read the medic's note carefully. Somewhere years ago, in a different institution, in a different set of circumstances, someone had not read hers. She had decided at some point after that the way to carry it forward was to become the person who read everything carefully. Every entry, every raw log, every 3-line note written in shorthand by someone who didn't expect it to matter. It always had the chance to matter. You just had to look. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of her bag where she kept things she needed to keep. She picked up her notebook. She had a morning briefing at 0800 with the command liaison for her current assignment, and after that, she had 3 training blocks to observe and a preliminary report structure to build. She was ready. She was almost out the door when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Ramon Diaz. She answered it. Diaz, she said. Ms. Reynolds. His voice was clear, unhurried, carrying the particular quality she had first noticed at the weapons line, the stillness that didn't come from a qualification program. I've got about 3 minutes before morning formation. I wanted to tell you something. Go ahead, she said. I put in for warrant officer candidacy, he said. The application went in yesterday. She stood in her doorway. That's the right call, she said. Yeah. A pause. I've been thinking about it for 2 years. I kept doing math about whether this was the right environment to move upward in, whether the people above me were the kind of people I wanted to learn from at that level. Another pause. The math changed. I know, she said. It wasn't just the report, he said, or the findings. It was, he stopped working out how to say it. It was watching Derek stand in front of the unit and say what he said. I've had 22 years of people in authority positions. I have never watched one of them do that. I didn't know that was something a person in that position could choose to do. She thought about 31 minutes without notes. It's a choice, she said. It cost him something. Not everyone makes it. I know, Diaz said. That's why it mattered, because he didn't have to. A brief silence. I want to be the kind of officer that's the reason someone else changes their math. I figured you should know that's what I'm aiming at. She stood in the doorway with the morning light behind her and the day ahead, and she felt the particular weight of a moment that was not about her at all, and was somehow in the way these things worked entirely connected to the work she had done. You'll get there, she said. Fix the reload hitch first. He laughed. An actual laugh, short and real. It's fixed, he said. Took me 3 weeks of dry fire. Good, she said. Good, he said. He hung up. She pocketed the phone. She walked out into the morning and let the door close behind her. She was going to be 3 minutes late to her briefing if she didn't move, and she didn't intend to be 3 minutes late, so she moved. The world outside was cold and clear and going about its business with the indifference of a world that does not stop for the resolution of individual stories. Cars moved. A siren went somewhere distant. A bird she couldn't identify made a sound above the roofline and was gone. She thought about Tomas Ruiz keying his radio with no math in it. She thought about Calvarsh running 6 miles on a morning he hadn't planned to run. She thought about Ramon Diaz in dry fire sessions, slow and methodical, working a flaw out of his technique over 3 weeks until it was gone. She thought about Derek Holloway in a leadership program in January, and whether his notebook was open, and whether his pen was moving, and she decided on no evidence at all to believe that it was. She was allowed to believe that. The report was filed. The findings were issued. The rest of it belonged to the people who were living it. She arrived at the briefing 2 minutes early. She opened her notebook. She uncapped her pen. A new set of quarterly flags. A new set of people. A different unit in a different state, carrying the same category of weight that units carried when the things that should be said were not being said, when the silence had compounded long enough to become the ambient sound of the place, and the people inside it had stopped hearing it as silence, and started hearing it as normal. She was here to hear the silence. She had learned to do that. Not in a training program, not in a qualification block, not from anyone who had sat down and taught it to her as a skill. She had learned it the hard way, the way she learned most things in environments where the cost of not hearing it was higher than the cost of any other mistake she could make. That was who she was. That was what she brought into every room she walked into. Not rank, not institutional authority, not the kind of presence that announced itself. Just attention. Complete unhurried methodical attention to what was actually in front of her and the willingness to write it down exactly as it was. The liaison officer came in at 0800. She looked up. She was ready. The quietest person in the room was always ready, and the people who had learned that lesson in Detachment 7 would carry it with them for the rest of their lives into every unit, every command, every room where someone had to decide whether to key the radio or stay silent. That was what she had left behind. Not a report. Not a case study. Not 31 minutes of carefully chosen words. A different answer to the oldest question in any institution. Is it worth it to speak in Detachment 7? The answer was yes. She had made sure of that. And that answer, once planted in the right